close enough. We danced the night away. We drank too much. I held your hair back when you were throwing up. Then you smiled over your shoulder. For a minute I was stone cold sober. I pulled you closer to my chest, and you asked me to stay over. I said I already told you. I think that you should get some rest. I knew I loved you then, but you never know. 'Cause I played it cool when I was scared of letting go. I know I needed you, but I'm never sure. I wanna stay with you until we're growing old. Just say you won't let go. Just say you won't let go. I'll wake you up.
Is my mic? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. Welcome to this event. My name's Avni Bajari, and I work for IPPR as IPPR rather than IPPR. As Associate Director of Public Services, but I'm an educationalist by background. Was a school teacher when I first started my career, so really very pleased to be asked to chair this event. I've got an exceptionally distinguished panel. You'll see on my left I've got Georgia Gould, now Minister for School Standards. Just asking Georgia how long she's been in post, a total of 3 weeks, she says. So really brilliant that she's here and speaking on this topic. Sarah Smith on my right, Mission Champion for Opportunity, also a Member of Parliament for Hindburgh and Hindburgh and Haslingden. Really welcome. And we have Jo Caseborn at the end. Thank you for being with us. Chief Executive Foundations and What Works Centre for Children and Families, and Ed Davies from the Centre for Social Justice as Research Director. An excellent set of people to talk about the topic at hand, which is questions around the old debate of what should schools be doing inside and outside the school gates. And there's an old debate that's been running for decades and decades. Is it that schools and education should be feeding the labour market? Is it that education should be for itself? And you know, there's a kind of interaction with disadvantage there. We've had various schools ministers talking about the best that has been thought and said, and the entitlement of disadvantaged pupils to access those thoughts and ideas. Is it more about schools in their communities and hubs of their communities and this kind of idea of the local? Or is it about preparation for adult life? And the likely answer is that it's many of these things and all of these things. But the thing that is different, despite that debate having raged for decades, if not longer, is that the context has absolutely changed, right? There's been underinvestment in services, children's services in schools, and the interacting services that support families. The definition of success of schooling has narrowed over time, and so we, at the end of a Conservative government, have often talked about attainment as the only measure of success for schools, and our schools policy levers have kind of combined around that measure. We've got increasing symptoms of, and I hate to say the word, but a crisis for young people, where mental health issues are at the fore. Attendance is low, persistent absence is high and rising, and that's just the kind of symptoms in schooling, and the crisis around young people demonstrates itself in lots of different ways. And then it doesn't take me to point this out. We've got the far right looming, and the threat of that, and the interaction between the way that young people are thinking, their crises points, and the extent to which that helps with radicalisation. So the question for us, and a great panel to discuss it, is what should the role of schools be in that environment, in that context? How do they interact with wider services and wider policy? and how can we broaden that debate to one that acknowledges the need for high standards but goes beyond it. And so I'll turn to my panelists to speak for 5 minutes apiece on that, and then we'll have some time for question and answer after that. I'll go from this side, and if you don't mind, Georgia, I'll start with you. Schools Minister, what should the role of schools be?
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here this morning, and I can see lots of people in the audience who I know are doing amazing work across this piece, so I'm sure it's going to be a really positive discussion. And I think this is, I said yes to coming to this discussion because I thought it was so important that you were focused on what was happening inside of schools and how schools connected to the broader community. And as you said, that there have been some brilliant steps forward in attainment, especially in English and maths, but there has also been a growing gap for disadvantaged pupils, and I think it's unacceptable that so many children leave school and go kind of right into unemployment and don't go into further education or training. How many young people, the extent of a disadvantage gap, and that's something that collectively we all need to address and do something about. And if I think about the last 14 years, I was in local government. Since 2010, I got elected as a very enthusiastic 24-year-old in 2010, all full of all the things we were going to do. But what we actually saw was, a decimation of so many different local services, and the kind of whole infrastructure around schools start to pull away, whether that's kind of early help or Sure Start. I can see some little babies on the front row, or the kind of wider kind of NHS support services. So much of that pulled away. And I remember talking to teachers who said they increasingly felt that like they had to be kind of early help workers and step into social work and mental health because they weren't able to refer young people to those wider services. So I think it's critical that schools are focused on and focused on the students that are falling behind, whether that's young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, young people with special educational needs, and that a lot needs to happen in the school, and that is about the kind of the best teaching and the best support going into supporting those young people. It's about having accountability that really makes inclusion kind of at the heart of what we do. I don't think there's any kind of rub between inclusion and high standards. High standards have to include a real focus on inclusion. It means having a broad curriculum and things in school that really inspire young people. But schools need to be rooted in and connected to communities. And I was thinking about this debate today, and I was thinking about two experiences in Camden. One after I was first elected, so I went to a really brilliant state school in Camden, and before that Westminster, and it was an outstanding school. It was seen as one of the best schools in the country, but the gap for disadvantaged pupils was absolutely massive. And when I kind of left school and became a counsellor, as I said, when I was about 23, the gap for white working class pupils in Camden at the time compared to the average was 30%. So despite being a great education system, there were lots of young people that were being failed. And I spent a lot of time talking to parents at the time, and they described their own experience at some of the same schools, having had a negative experience, and they were obviously wanted their children to do well, but they would often feel that when they went into schools that they felt patronized, that they didn't have that relationship. They sometimes felt embarrassed that they couldn't help their children with their homework. And when we started to really work with those parents, they started to design their own kind of courses to support their children. They started, and as that happened, they started themselves to kind of go back into education. And I remember one of the mums saying to me, I thought if you messed up at school, that was it for me, that you kind of stopped learning. But actually, I've realised, that I can do it now. And people went back and did their English and Maths GCSEs, and they took new opportunities. So I think there is something really critical about how we support families as part of our education system. And the other thing I was thinking about, I can see the cabinet member for schools in Camden in the audience, so he'll remember this, was you had really falling roles in London, and there was a proposal to close one of the primary schools because it was not financially viable. And we had this, absolute kind of this eruption from the community about this school. And they were like, this school is the heart of our community. And we talk sometimes about the lack of trust in schools and system, but actually they were like, this is the place we feel most safe. This is where we connect into other services. If you take this school away from us, you're taking away the kind of soul of the community. And it's not just the teachers, it's the teaching assistants, it's the lunch staff, it's the receptionists. That's who I go to if I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to access services. And so we kind of changed our proposal and decided to merge this school with another school and to use the space that had been created to put in different services, because actually let's build on that trust, and this school being the kind of anchor at the heart of the community, and bring employment support, bring adult community learning, bring local enterprise, bring that into the schools, so you start to build on where there is trust. So I think that if we're going to kind of address the issues that we see in school, we have to see the kind of full connection with the community. We have to, wrap around some of that wider support, whether that's access to youth clubs, enrichment, some of the kind of creative opportunities, whether it's access to mental health support. I can see someone from Speech and Language UK in the audience, whether that's speech and language support. The schools need to be connected to that wider support offer. And I think the real promise of the Opportunity Mission is it's a collective effort. Schools are part of it, but all the pressure can't be just on schools, just on teachers. It has to be us thinking about how we support families from the Best Start hubs through the different transition points, through to young people getting into work. And that requires businesses, and it requires wider public services. And I think if everyone pulls together in that way around the opportunities for young people, transformative things happen. I saw that in my own borough, but I also have seen that in many other parts of the country, because it's easy to talk about the problems, but there is amazing practice going on. People are leading this work, sometimes feeling they're doing it kind of against the system, but I think if we make this, like part of accountability, and some of the changes to Ofsted around inclusion, I think are really important, and make this part of our kind of government coming together around the opportunities of young people, we can do something very different that actually really takes on these long-term systemic issues that we've seen.
Thank you very much, Minister. Over to you, Sarah. Some really interesting thoughts there. 5 minutes on the subject of inside and outside the school gates.
Yeah, thank you. And just to say how delighted I am, and genuinely how fortunate we all are that we have Georgia in this role. She has already made an impact in the work that she's tasked with. And it's not an easy job right now to be the schools minister. We know that our schools are struggling with lots of things, and certainly for me, the number one issue that comes up whenever I go and see my head teachers in Hyndburn is around SEND, and obviously that's one of the most pressing things that Georgia's now taking a look at. But just listening to how she saw and tackled those issues in her responsibilities previously in Camden gives you a sense of that approach of genuinely listening and being able to pivot where what's coming back up from the ground might be slightly different to what the initial ambition or thoughts were from those that were setting out the roadmap. And I think that's really, really powerful. But to talk a bit more about the Opportunity Mission. So many of you won't know, but before being elected, I've spent the last 15, 17 years really trying to tackle educational disadvantage. I first got involved in the Labour Party because I used to volunteer in a youth club, and it was the early days of the coalition government, and every decision about austerity was hitting young people the hardest, and I thought that was wrong. At a very simple level, I thought that young people deserved a youth club. I thought young people deserved support to be able to afford to get the bus to college. I thought that just because a young person had not done well in education did not mean they were a failure. It meant probably that the system had failed them, and that it was probably the most important priority for me of any government to make sure that we could break the connection that pervades to this day, that the postcode in which you were born will dictate so many of your future life outcomes. It's not fair, it's not morally right, but it's also not economically right, because it means that in places like Hyndburn, which most of you will have never heard about, but is this beautiful part of the country, Accrington Stanley is our football club, we get lost between Blackburn and Burnley. Kids are getting forgotten and left behind every single day because they're not growing up, and I hate to say it now with the minister being from London, they're not growing up in a London borough and they're not growing up in Blackpool. And places like that get loads of attention and loads of resources stuck at them. And then there's lots of places right now that just don't get that same opportunity. And there's a real postcode lottery going on in this country, not just between different regions and different constituencies, but actually also between different schools, because we haven't got the right governance in place to make sure that every mainstream school is inclusive. And we haven't got the right funding mechanisms in place to make sure that regardless of where you're growing up, when your needs are identified, they are met and the interventions are there at the earliest possible point. And that's why I'm really proud to be the champion for the Opportunity Mission, because this government is taking a whole system approach to how we're trying to tackle and disconnect those two facts, where you're born and where you end up. And whether that's with the rollout of the breakfast clubs, whether that's about delivering on the commitment around early years education, which is absolutely critical to tackling disadvantage, because we know kids on free school meals start school 5 months behind those that are not pupil premium. Whether that's about today's announcement, which is that young people that end up unemployed will get the commitment of a job after a period of time on universal credit. We have to do all these things together to make a difference. Now, one of the bits of work I did, and we surveyed loads of young people and teachers and employers and parents on this issue in an organisation I worked for, is we asked what should be the purpose of our education system, which kind of gets to the heart of the question today. And what came back was that they perceived that most people thought right now the purpose was getting GCSEs, but what they thought the purpose ought to be was something much bigger than that. And for me, I think that's about lifelong learning and developing a love of learning, so that through whatever challenges that the economy might throw at you, you can still pick yourself up again and take the skills and the capabilities to re-engage with the education system throughout your lives. And the best schools delivering on that love of learning are the ones that are seen as hubs into their community, that work in partnership with local organisations and charities, and are an enabler for everything else that's going on in that community. Those are the ones that where I see the leadership that delivers inclusivity and genuinely for every single child, and where you hear those stories of parents who just like see it as their one-stop shop for everything. And so I think there's a responsibility for us as the government to make sure that we enable that leadership as easily as possible. So the systems are with them, the funding is with them to lead in that way, because right now there are perverse incentives that mean some leaders lead very differently to that, and they actually get rewarded for it. And I think that's kind of where we're starting to unpick things with Ofsted, with the curriculum and assessment review, and with the schools white paper that will be coming forward.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Dr. Jo Caseborn.
Thank you very much. I'm from Foundations. We're the What Works Centre for Children and Families, so we're very passionate about making sure that we use evidence to really change outcomes for children and their parents and the wider community. So I'm going to focus on what happens outside the school gates in this session, and specifically in the home. And there's understandably lots of focus in the Best Start in Life strategy on the role of schools and childcare, as there should be. But of course, we all know that children spend much more time with their parents and their caregivers than they do in school. So children, schools and childcare settings can't improve outcomes on their own. We need to be supporting parents as well. And we mustn't lose sight of the fact that whilst schools educate, parents are the ones who shape the conditions that make learning possible. And if children are arriving at school hungry, stressed, not toilet trained, which we've heard a lot about recently, or unable to control their behaviour, their ability to learn is already compromised before we've even started. And children learn how to communicate, how to manage their emotions, solve problems, build relationships, first and foremost at home. And when parents are equipped with the strategies and confidence that they need, children are much less likely to be faced with behavioural difficulties, school exclusion, or poor mental health. And the evidence backs this up. We know that early parenting support, lots of which we saw in the last Labour government, where there was real investment, reduces the need for costly interventions later on, and it saves resources and it protects children from harm. And of course, it's also about reducing inequality, because we know that some parents understandably struggle. Not surprising if they're living in poverty, in housing insecurity, if they have mental health struggles of their own, they have their own childhood trauma, and so on. All of that can make parenting much, much harder. The evidence also tells us that gaps in children's development open up early, and by supporting parenting in families who are facing risk and disadvantages, we can narrow those gaps early and ensure that every child, regardless of their background, has the same chance to thrive, because of course all of this is about thriving as well as achieving. Which brings me to the good level of development target. We must make sure that we don't meet this target just by helping those nearest the line over the line. If we do that, we've missed the point of the target. Only when we start to shift the dial on outcomes for the most vulnerable children will we truly be able to say that we've made headway on the opportunity mission. And we know that the most vulnerable children, they need targeted support that deliver outcomes for them. And when I talk about outcomes, I mean things like children feeling safer and being safer at home, having positive emotional well-being, being supported by their wider family networks, and so on. And of course, that's where really excitingly Best Start Family Hubs come in. And the new Best Start in Life strategy specifically talks about evidence-based parenting being at the heart of Best Start Family Hubs. So we were delighted to see that. This is such progress. We've been talking for many years as the Early Intervention Foundation and now as foundations about the need for evidence-based parenting, and seeing it embedded in what the government is doing is really, really exciting. And the plan for Family Hubs to provide that single front door for early help for families at risk should mean that family workers can provide targeted or specialist support quickly before problems escalate, crucially, and protect the most vulnerable children in doing so. So we're really encouraged to see Best Start Family Hubs are going to be working alongside schools to prioritise services that reduce the risks that families face. So we're talking here about domestic abuse, parental conflict, substance abuse and mental health for parents, which we know can contribute to poor outcomes for children. So our role in all of this as the What Works Centre for Children and Families is to ensure that targeted services are evidence-based and improve those outcomes for the most vulnerable children. And of course, the hard work is just getting started in all of this. And in front of us is such an exciting opportunity to harness the momentum of the spending review, that extra investment that we've seen come through, and of course, the Best Start in Life strategy itself. And of course, the passion that we've seen from ministers and from those championing the opportunity mission to really shift the dial to change outcomes for children and families. So we're really excited about what's happening at the moment, and we very much look forward to playing our part. Thank you.
Finally, over to you, Ed.
Yeah, it's so interesting and so good that you are talking about in and out of school, and hearing Jo talk about that feels so important. We work with about 800 grassroots charities at the CSJ. We work with lots of schools, and what we never hear about is the curriculum, and we're decreasingly hearing about pay and conditions. The last few strikes in schools have been about behaviour. I don't know if you saw the last head of Ofsted in the newspaper this weekend saying there's a real danger that we just turn schools into therapeutic centres. And so I want to take a bit of a 30,000-foot view of this and think about why do we have some of the most unhappy children in the world, which we do at the moment. And I want to take it from the view of, I joined the CSJ about 18 months ago, but before that I was a senior civil servant in the Department of Health. And I want to talk about 3 things that came across my desk during my years in the Department of Health that we just don't talk about, but are fundamentally affecting children. And I'm afraid they're all difficult, complicated, contentious areas, but I think that's why we don't talk about them. So the first one, under the last government, is childcare. We talked about increasing childcare to 30 hours a week from 9 months old. And a number of organisations got in touch with us and said, have you done the risk assessment on attachment? And nobody in government had done that risk assessment. This is a Treasury-driven move to get more people into work. When we poll parents, we find this isn't necessarily what parents want, particularly in those first 2 years. They want flexibility. And the reason they want flexibility is because they know that having a secure attachment in those 2 years is fundamentally important. Now, I know that's difficult. I have children. Me and my wife both went back to work after 1 year because of the economics of it, and that's where everyone finds themselves. But we can't be building an economy that we know is damaging to children. and then be surprised when our children say they are damaged. So that was the first thing that came across my desk. If you thought that was tricky. Second thing that came across my desk, we did a huge consultation on mental health treatment in the UK. We had 5,000 responses into the department. We had 500 from organisations and institutions working in this space, and 4,500 individuals working in this space. What was the top thing you think came out in terms of keeping good mental health? Have a think for yourself. What is the most important thing in your life? It was family relationships, by a mile. So we looked into what is going on in family relationships in the UK. About that time, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, if you're familiar with them, produced a brilliant series of reports on inequality in the UK, the Deaton Review of Inequality, and one of them was about family inequalities. And what it found was over the last 50 years ago, if you were sitting your O-levels in school, you had a 90% chance of living with both your parents. If you're doing it today, sitting your GCSEs, it's 50-50. We've had this total change in family stability in the UK in the last 50 years, and it really matters to our mental health. And so while I was there, I dug into the NHS figures as well. And the ONS did a cut of the NHS figures looking at families, and they found that if you are in a married household, you have a 6% chance as a primary school child of having a serious diagnosable mental health condition. In a cohabiting household, it doubles to 12%, and in a separated household, it triples to 18%. Now, it's really important to say, 82% of those separated households are absolutely fine. This is not a death sentence. Life happens. But we are increasingly stacking the deck against children, and we are seeing it in our schools every single day. The third thing I want to talk about, and this again came up, and it's still coming up everywhere, is I want to talk about these things. Mobile phones. We are putting in the pocket of almost every 11-year-old in the country beheading videos, hardcore pornography, suicidal ideation. That's at the extreme end. We were doing some research on choking, and I'm sorry, we're going to get quite graphic here. If you're over 50, there's a 3% chance you've ever been choked during sex. If you're under 30, it's 1 in 3. But these are fundamentally changing how boys and girls relate to each other at the moment, and we are not talking about it. But even if we don't look at the extreme end, just the scrolling. I worked with sixth formers for a while, and they would say TikTok is just this candy floss where I just scroll through and get trapped for hours on end. And it's not just TikTok. They all have these short videos now. YouTube, Facebook, they all have them. I have serious concerns about adults having these things, frankly. I don't know why adults need to see beheading videos and hardcore pornography. 20 years ago, we regulated this stuff a lot more than we do now. But I think the adults need to start doing hard things for the children so that they don't have to do hard things. And I think that means regulating these phones a lot more closely. Just coming back to the origin then, thinking about what this means for inside and outside schools. I think we put way too much pressure on schools to do this stuff. But I think at the very minimum, if schools are going to have to confront this stuff, they need to understand what's going on. And some of these drivers of poor mental health in our children are just not being discussed at the moment.
I think that one of the drivers, the kind of biggest driver I've seen over the last 14 years is poverty. And I think, you know, if I think about some of the cases I saw of like poor behaviour, like a young boy who had a fight in the lunch queue and got excluded, and it turned out he hadn't eaten till the day before, or, you know, families that are being made homeless and in temporary accommodation or in severely overcrowded homes, and the kind of stress that for particularly parents who are having to work 3 jobs, you know, that poverty is driving a lot of the kind of the trends that you're talking about. So I think it's less, there's so many, mums who will be trying to kind of do everything for their kids, but they're finding that actually they're having to work all these jobs and not being there. So I think we can't ignore how fundamental poverty is to driving the issues that children come to school with, and I think that's missing from the things you spoke about.
I'm going to go to some questions now, unless either of the panellists want to come back on anything that Ed said.
I'd just add that there's a really good evidence base on parental conflict. And again, as Georgia said, what we see is that economic stress leads to parental conflict. Parental conflict then has very negative outcomes on children. And we're not talking about domestic abuse end of the spectrum here. We're talking about day-to-day, how parents relate to each other and argue and so on. And the relationship between economic stress, poverty is so strong. And we've got evidence-based support for parental conflict that we're now bedding into family hubs, which I think is a really positive step.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to take them in threes, if that's okay. So I'll start at this side of the room, lady at the front, gentleman just behind her, and on the same horizontal line. Sorry, Emma.
Okay. Hi, good morning, panel. I'm Zoe Palmer from UNICEF UK. It's been touched on already a little bit, Sarah. You talked about the learning gap, about how actually some of these disadvantages and unequal outcomes have already begun before children even enter into the school gates. And Minister, you also talked about poverty. Children under 5 are the biggest group that experience poverty than any other age group. And we also know over the last 15 years or so, investment in under 5s has gone down significantly more than any other group as well. Part of that is to do with cuts to local services and provision for early childhood. And another significant part of that is to do with a decline in social security for families with children under 5, in particular the 2-child limit. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how we do give children the best start in life and how we do work towards that milestone, taking into consideration both the need for services but also more social security support for young children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman behind.
Hello there, my name's Pete. I'm a Chief Executive of a charity that supports families down in Hertfordshire. I've got 2 points. Firstly, when we look at schools and we talk about pastoral support, it's now more social welfare. And we've got to really acknowledge that where we call them a pupil or a student or a parent, health calls them a patient, housing associations call them a resident or a tenant. But they're all human beings and they need to interlink. And would a head teacher go to a GP clinic and say, can you help my young person spell? No. And we've got to be frank about that. And increasing the resources so schools aren't left to do cleaning teeth and all the other things in social welfare. Another thing that I'd like to raise is that I think I've been working with young people in schools for a canny while now, and I think we've had 8 prime ministers. And I was part of Extended Schools, and we were part of Sure Start, and governments come and governments go, and then the funding gets cut. There are some fantastic organisations there that have been really entrepreneurial, who've now, when you look at data sets, our data set is men and women who we were working with 10 years ago, who are married with children, who are saying, if we didn't have this opportunity, that opportunity, I would not be doing what I'm doing now. And you can't argue about that. That isn't a data set that we've been driven over the last couple of years. And I would really welcome the government to investigate and research these entrepreneurial systems, whether it's a charity, a kick or whatever, about how they've been doing that so you can upscale that type of approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more, just...
Hi, my name's Tom Gunter. I'm a senior policy advisor at Nesta, and prior to that I was an assistant head teacher at Reach Academy Feltham, which offers a kind of cradle to career model. And thinking about what the minister said about, you know, connecting up services, I was wondering what more could be done to make sure that the services which need spaces can be connected a little bit better to the existing infrastructure that we have, nurseries and schools, kind of pulling those things together. What are the kind of practical steps that we need to take at this point to make sure that type of thing can happen?
Thank you very much. I'll let the panel respond to those. So it's underinvestment in under 5s, schools and pastoral support and connecting up services. Georgia, would you like to begin?
Sure. So on the issue, starting with poverty, and as I said, I think it's a fundamental issue, and I think that there's a lot that has already happened. Talked about that child that was excluded because, you know, he was fighting and hadn't eaten since the day before. That's, you know, really proud to have been extending free breakfast clubs this week to another 500,000 children, and you'll know we've extended free school meals, which will lift 100,000 children out of poverty. So these things will make a massive difference. We've got the Child Poverty Task Force that's looking kind of more widely and will report in the autumn, but kind of all the options are kind of on the table as we look into that. But, you know, I think that the two go hand in hand, and we have to kind of understand the kind of huge impact poverty has on families. And then there were 2 questions that were linked around schools not having to kind of take on the whole. As I said, you know, you can't expect schools to have to do all of it, but I think there is an expectation that schools are connected into those services that can create that support. And I think that is important because schools have a huge amount of trust. They're where families come, and they can make the ability to make links and kind of wrap teams around families and children. Schools play a key part in that. So there's an expectation of schools to be open to that, but then there's an expectation to wider public services, to health, to employment, to connect into schools and the spaces that schools have. So it's on both sides, and there is a kind of increasing investment. We talked about the best start hubs and support for families, but if you look into it, there's often lots of families who aren't taking up the support that they are entitled to. And when I was in the Cabinet Office prior to this role, we developed a program called Test, Learn and Grow, which was, all about how we make policy, not always doing it in a room in Whitehall, but doing it with those on the ground. You talked about the kind of pioneers, the ones who are innovating, learning from teachers, charities, parents. And one of the things we were looking at was access to family hubs and working with parents to really spread the message to ensure those parents who most need that support have access to it. And we were working in Sheffield and saw huge increases that's being rolled out. So I think I couldn't agree more that we need to be learning from the innovation on the ground, because there are amazing local authorities, amazing trusts, amazing charities who are doing all of this. There's not many ideas where there isn't a brilliant organisation already leading it, but we need to be kind of sharing and scaling that to different contexts. And I think that's the opportunity of the new RISE teams that the DfE have built up, that they will be out in the regions, working with those on the ground, finding that best practice and sharing it, and where schools are really struggling to be able to kind of support the lessons from elsewhere. And you always have to build on the strengths and assets of individual communities, but I think there is a lot of innovation going on. And I also think through the Opportunity Mission, there's real, I keep doing this, there's real opportunities in the Opportunity Mission, but there's opportunities for kind of philanthropy, for social impact funding to all come together around, these kind of bedrock services, from Best Start in Life through to the support going in around skills and enrichment, to kind of build out a real offer for children everywhere in Hindburn as much as in Camden.
Thank you. Ed, did you want to come back on?
Just on a couple of those, yeah. I think that school readiness thing is really interesting. When that moment you start school, are you ready? We've been doing a lot of work on boys recently at the CSJ, looking at what's going on there. And the milestone that the government has set is 75% of kids to be school ready. And in girls, we've hit 75%. We're there. So we've hit that milestone. But in boys, it's only 60%. And so thinking about what happens preschool, it's quite important that we think about boys, actually, which is sort of counterintuitive, because we've made a lot of gains for girls over the last 40, 50 years, which is a good thing. But at the moment, that's where the issue seems to lie, which I think is quite important to note. And just on the poverty thing, couldn't agree more. I think poverty is a massive issue, and you see it every day turning up in schools. The one thing I push back slightly on is, what can we learn from people in poverty as to what works in schools? And we looked at GCSE results this year, and we looked at the Family Resources Survey to see who's getting good results and who isn't. And what you find is that particularly ethnic minority families from stable families do incredibly well. So most Asian children, even on free school meals, do better than average, whereas white working class families don't. And when you look at what's going on at home, about 1 in 5 children in a white working class household live with both parents, but about 6 in 10 from non-white families. So poverty is absolutely an issue, but there is social capital that you can put into families as well, which makes an enormous difference. And I think we need to be talking about both and, not either or.
And there's something about intergenerational poverty, because when I was working, we talk about white working class achievement, which is a massive issue around the country, but it's a massive issue in Camden, which is one of the most diverse places. And often the families that I spoke to had kind of lived in the same place, gone to the same schools without there being social mobility. So they'd lost faith that things could change for them or their kids. So it's something about that being so entrenched, and it's so important, I think, that we address poverty, but also kind of support children to see the kind of what's possible for them, and really build in kind of aspiration and career support. We used to hold a primary school careers conference, so from very early on, they can see what's possible in their lives.
Joe, anything from the questions, or perhaps you want to come back on the intergenerational poverty or family circumstances points?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the importance of focusing on the early years that came up in the questions. And we know what works here. Intensive home visiting in the early years, from pregnancy through to when children are babies and then older and going on into school. Like, we know that works. We know early speech and language is really, really crucial to stop those gaps opening up and getting wider and wider in attainment later. We've got models like the Family Nurse Partnership that was brought across in the last Labour government that really helps support families. So we know what works. And I think actually what's most important is that we're using evidence-based services. The settings that those services take place in is secondary as far as we're concerned. It's about making sure the right services that are evidence-based are being delivered for families.
Thank you very much. Sarah?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that my years of experience tell me that we have to do bottom up and top down. So, and when I say that yes, using evidence-informed practice is really, really important, but you have to give the power to the people in that community to work out how it works in that community. Because dictating from Whitehall or even Manchester, thinking about Greater Manchester, right? The same thing isn't going to work in Salford compared to Ashton-under-Lyne. I don't know Manchester that well because I'm not actually a Manchester MP. Bad example. But you know, so but if you can enable, so if the system enables, and this is what George was doing under her previous role, putting the conditions in place and the structures in place so that local people get around the table and say, we need to do something about literacy in our community because it's like really, really low levels, and that's meaning that kids are disengaging from school and all the other consequences of that. Okay, here's the pulling off EEF or wherever you go for your evidence of some of the solutions that might work, but then designing them into how they are locally owned, locally led, and locally delivered. And that means they'll be a bit different somewhere down the road, and that's okay. And I think we need this kind of ability to give the national frameworks and accountability with locally enabled funding and structures that give communities time to design the solutions for them. I think that is the only way that you deal with the complexity of the challenges we're talking about. I think very briefly, completely agree on this. I went through antenatal classes not that long ago, and I find it genuinely quite scary. And it was all, it was funded because I was in a very poor part of the country, so it wasn't I was paying money to go down the road. But there was nothing on phones, there was nothing on screens, and I find that quite concerning because Miss Rachel isn't good for your children, anyone that uses it, and I'm not making any judgment there, but it's not because of the speed with which they show images. It actually impacts on how your child brains develop. But no one knows that, so how are we able to make better choices? Forget the parents that you need to persuade to make better choices and have to work much more intensively with, just for the average Brit on the street. So there's a lot of work to be done around, I think, us equipping ourselves with the information about how to utilize screens and phones safely, as well as potentially more interventionist approaches to policy around it, which I personally would support around children, but I'm not the minister to make those decisions.
And take three more, try and fit 2 more rounds in, so let's be as quick as we can. Gentleman at the back to start, please.
Thank you. Musa Zahed from the Investing and Saving Alliance. I had a question for the Minister. We know that the government is working on a financial inclusion strategy. I was just wondering if there's any type of alignment between the HMT and the Department for Education when it comes to financial education and financial capability. Just to mention, we have also responded to the Becky Francis review on the curriculum review as well. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, you laid at the end.
Thank you. I'm Nicole from Ambitious About Autism. So I just wanted to pick up on something the Minister said about behavior. So SEND and unmet SEND needs is also a big driver, not only to mental health, but also what is perceived as bad behavior. And children with SEND, they are a lot more likely to be suspended, to be excluded, to be isolated in many different ways while they're in school. So it gives me a lot of hope to hear kind of the amount of empathy and consideration that's being given in this panel, but at the same time, the approach that the government has had with attendance and behavior so far, and kind of the reappointment of the behavior advisor, it just feels like there is a continuity to the same approach that we had before with kind of Nick and Gove. So I wonder is this something that we should expect as a change? Is this kind of approach to inclusion going to trickle down to every policy in the Department of Education, or is something that is going to kind of continue as a silo work?
Thank you. One more from this side. Sorry, lady in the middle over here.
Thanks so much. I'm Jane from Speech and Language UK. I just wanted to really endorse that question, first of all, because 78% of teachers say that children with speech and language challenges are being unfairly punished in school, and that's a really huge issue. But I want to ask about something else. So it was really great to talk about speech and language support from outside school, which is definitely an issue. But there's also an issue about whether schools really understand that speech and language is actually a fundamental skill before literacy, before numeracy, before even behaviour. But yet we don't at the moment give schools any tools to track that, and it seems crazy that we're tracking literacy and numeracy, but after the early years foundations stage we're not tracking speech and language development, even though it's part of our, I mean, we wouldn't be in this room having this conversation if we didn't all have those skills. So is there room for the government to commission, as the Welsh Government have done something in this area, to commission a free tool that all schools can use, so that particularly the schools with stretched budgets can actually find out where children are on that level of development?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll go back to you, Minister, to start with. There were questions that were directed to you. We've got financial education, behaviour and SEND, and then the specifics around speech and language.
Yes, so on the financial education, so you'll know that Becky Francis is doing the curriculum and assessment review, and I think almost every conversation I have, this comes up. So it's come up a huge amount, I think, going into that. I won't kind of prejudge the review, but like to say a bit of a trailer, I'm sure that it's going to be addressed within that, and then the government's response. So kind of watch that space. To the question about special educational needs, behaviour, attendance and support. And, you know, I think that we, at the moment, you talked, Sarah, about the kind of challenges and the special educational needs system as a whole. And it's, you know, from local government, it was probably one of the biggest issues that I had, both with parents who were saying exactly what you said today, that they felt that their kind of children's needs weren't being met early enough, that things were escalating because support wasn't being put in place, that they were ending up being suspended and excluded from school, through to teachers saying that, you know, we are struggling. We do not have the training or the resource or the space to be able to support children. So I think there's a massive need for change in this space. I think schools need to be equipped to be able to support children with special educational needs. They need that right training. We need to be intervening and supporting a lot earlier. And I think some of the investment we've made is kind of send leads with Invest Start in Life, because, you know, to not allow things to escalate, but also it's important to have spaces in schools where children can kind of go to regulate and that understanding. But we also know that kind of calm schools are where children with special educational needs really thrive. So it's not saying that we're not going to have a strong behaviour policy, but it's saying that we need the kind of the support in place to have really inclusive schools. And I think that the kind of, I mentioned earlier, the change in Ofsted accountability to focus on inclusion is a big moment. You know, as we take forward our wider work around SEND, you'll see more, I think, about how we equip schools to be truly inclusive within all schools. And I've seen amazing examples of this. You know, in Camden, there was we had integration bases where I'd go and visit children who had been excluded, and they had no idea they'd been excluded. They thought that they were just in a really enjoyable place, that they were kind of having a bit more specialist support, and then they were going back into mainstream school because they'd had that specialist support. And I've seen I met a young person in a school that was doing this brilliantly the other day, who similarly had been excluded from another school and was now back into mainstream, and you know, he was thriving. So that, you know, it can be done, and I think they're great examples. On attendance, I think, we are really committed to having real kind of rigor on attendance. We've got very good data. We know how critical it is for children's outcomes to be in school, and it's important that school is engaging and supportive, but I think we will really continue to push to ensure that every child has a place, but that they are in school, because, the gap grows so much worse if children are missing school. And to the question about speech and language support, again, this is something that's being looked at in the curriculum and assessment review, but it's something that I'm really, really aware of, and I think that's an area where parents definitely need more support. Me and Sarah both have little ones, so it's something I'm thinking a lot about personally at the moment. And you know that I met some of the young people, or one of the young people who had not had that support at school and heard that experience is very much sitting with me. So I think it's something that kind of there's a lot on in early years, and we need to think about as we go through the school system. So really appreciate your comments. Oh. Do we need to run?
There is no planned fire alarm.
Okay.
It's just we.
Oh.
Okay.
It's a bit like
Where is the head teacher to lead us? It's fine. Okay.
It's a test. Okay. It's a test.
I've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to go back to the audience. I'm going to take 3 extremely brief questions.
Sorry, let some other people answer questions.
And 3 lines each from the panel in response. Lady at the front here.
Thank you very much. Juliet from Campaign for Learning. I am so delighted that you're talking in the way that you are about schools and joining things up, because that will be the thing that makes a massive difference. But I have 2 questions, 2 pleas, really.
Brief as you can, please.
Okay,
Thank you.
first
Sorry to rush you.
Family learning is the foundation of lifelong learning. We need it in every school, universal offer, because actually, when I was delivering, it moved into parenting. You could identify some of the issues, but it's public domain. Learning is public domain. Parenting is private domain. That's why the stigma. Second thing, there's a brilliant piece of research that's come out, which you really need to look at, by Dr. Kate Jones, which was with school in-service teachers that have no training and support, and identified, but what they identified was that they were saying that 70% of them ticked that parents don't care box when they talked about barriers, and it's because they haven't got the training and support. So please do look at that research.
Very brief, please. I'll give you 2 lines for a question.
Just very brief. So I've been a head teacher for 19 years and now a trust leader looking after 15,000 pupils and 34 head teachers. My plea is actually to say schools do want to be in this work, and too often I hear that schools can't do this and shouldn't be doing that. I think it's a complete mistake, and I think we should be centering schools as the anchor of communities and look at how we actually find an integration post fragmentation of academisation.
And I'm going to generously hand over my closing remarks. Time for 3 closing sentences from each part of the panel. Address those questions or anything else that you'd like to say. Jo.
I'm just going to pick up on something Sarah said earlier, which I couldn't agree more with, which is about the importance of not just parachuting things into communities and working with local communities to see what they want and what they need. And I think that's where you can bring evidence together with local need. And we're doing that in our Evidence into Practice offer, where we're funding evidence leads in local authority to say, what does my population need? What does the evidence say? How can we work together? And that's got to be the future, I think.
Thank you, Jo.
Couldn't agree more. And it's more fundamental because, right now, trust in society, in politics, in institutions is hitting kind of all-time lows, and there's being alternatives put out there that are anything but, that are trying to blame certain people, are trying to promise the earth when they can't deliver it. And so putting power back in the hands of our communities and our amazing head teachers up and down this country, and absolutely the best head teachers want it all. Like, they want everything, they want it from their school, they want to just be enabled, and they want to crack on and get on with it. And so, you know, putting the power into those people's hands, giving people stake in their future once again, and hope for their community and for their children will tackle that rise of reform at the same time. So there's nothing more important, and I'll be doing all I can to back Georgia and the team in their work around this.
Super. Thank you very much, Sarah. Ed?
I just wanted to pick up on the attendance point, actually. A couple of really practical things. We keep hearing from children and their parents, what's the point? And actually, a third of kids basically come out of school with nothing. And they know who they are from age about 11 or 12, and their classmates know who they are. And we've got to give them some hope in schools. And so a couple of practical things. We really underuse sport, particularly with boys. We just don't do enough sport. Get them running around. There are a lot of innovative schools around the world now. There's one in New York mixing every lesson with basketball. Let's use sport a bit more. And the other one, there's some really interesting work going on in Manchester at the moment, the Manchester Baccalaureate, that tries to get employers into schools from really quite young, age 12 or 13. My son got a job stacking shelves a couple of years ago, and he hated the first month. He hated it, rubbish job. And then he got his paycheck. My goodness, did he love stacking shelves after that. And when I worked at the British Medical Journal, there was a senior editor, who was a doctor, who said the most sensitive nerve in the body is the pocket nerve. And I think we can use that more with these kids, age 12, 13, and say, you might hate this. GCSEs might not be your thing, but here's a job at the end of it if you just stick with it.
Georgia, over to you.
Yeah, to your question, I think there's some lots of like really unhelpful kind of ideas in education that set up against each other. So the idea of like trusts versus local authorities or communities. And, you know, I had a really brilliant meeting with lots of trust leads, and they were saying the best trusts are, you know, anchors, civic anchors. And I think you need both. You need the ability to innovate and that connection and route into communities. And similarly, we talked a bit like almost the standards versus inclusion, but you can't have high standards without inclusion. You know, you need high standards for all children. So, you know, I think that I think there's a massive opportunity to bring some of that together. And it's really interesting going from local to central government, because at a local level, you kind of intrinsically know that you have families that live in communities, that work in communities, that travel around communities. And central government can really look at people through real silos of we look at their jobs, or we look at their education, or we look at their health. And that's just not how people live. And I think the real prize and the prize of missions is we start to really see people within their lives and communities. And schools are a massive part of that. And I talked about the kind of trust that they had, that they have within those communities. And then I wholeheartedly agree about the importance of power and doing things with people. So I talked at the start about that project I did with parents. And I think if we'd gone in and said to those parents, we want you to do this parenting program because we think you need this, it would have failed. What we went in and said, what's going on? What do you want? What would be helpful? And they built it. And because they started to feel some power over their own learning, you know, I remember one parent saying, I used to feel like I was in a cage, and now I feel I can learn and my life is changing. And that is an amazing experience, but you know, you need to really hand over power and let them to create the change, and that's true for young people as well. So, you know, it's how you do things is as important as what you do. And I think it's exciting that there is so much going on, and if we can connect that, I think we can see real change very fast.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel for what turns out to be like a really hopeful and optimistic conversation around how schools and other services can move the dial on some of the systemic challenges that we have with children and young people. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for attending, and yeah, thank you.
We keep this love in a photograph. We made these memories for ourselves, where our eyes are never closing, hearts are never broken, time's forever frozen still. So you can keep me inside the pocket of your